He looked straight at me, into my eyes, and smiled the way a man smiles at a stranger he's hoping to impress. Not the woman he married. Not the woman whose name is still on his insurance forms, his emergency contact list, his gym membership. A stranger. For 3 full seconds, I thought about walking away and letting him keep believing that. But I didn't come to that ballroom to disappear quietly. I came to find out exactly how invisible I had become. And by the end of the night, I was going to make sure he never forgot my face again. If this story pulls you in, stay until the end because the last 30 seconds are the part people message me about the most. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep going. My name is Adrienne Castellan. I'm 38 years old, and 11 months ago, I was married to a man who once told a room full of his colleagues that I was the quiet one at home who handled things. That sentence sat in my chest for 2 years before I understood what it actually meant. I want to take you back to where this really started, because the charity auction wasn't the beginning. It was the ending of something that had been dying quietly for a long time. I met my husband, Marcus Hale, when I was 29. He was sharp, funny, and ambitious in a way that felt exciting instead of exhausting back then. He worked in commercial real estate development, the kind of job where dinners are actually meetings and vacations are actually networking trips. I worked as an interior architect, mostly for boutique hotels and private residences. It wasn't a flashy career, but it was mine, and I was good at it. For the first 4 years of our marriage, we were a team. We renovated our own house together on weekends, arguing over paint swatches and laughing about it later. He used to introduce me at parties by saying, "This is Adrienne. She's the reason our house doesn't look like a hotel lobby." People would laugh. I would smile. It felt like being chosen every single time. Then Marcus made senior partner at his firm, and something in the architecture of our marriage shifted. The way a house settles unevenly after you remove a load-bearing wall you didn't know was holding something up. The dinners together became working dinners without me. The weekend trips became solo work trips he apologized for, and then eventually stopped apologizing for altogether. And somewhere in that transition, the way he introduced me at parties changed too. I stopped being the reason the house doesn't look like a hotel lobby. I became my wife. She does some design stuff, said in the same flat tone you'd use to mention where you park the car. I want to be honest with you. I didn't notice all of this happening in real time. Nobody does. Neglect doesn't arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrives in small doses you can talk yourself out of, one missed dinner at a time, until one day you look up and you don't recognize the shape of your own life anymore. There were warning signs I explained away, the way you do when you love someone and don't want to believe the worst. His phone started staying face down on the counter, a habit he'd never had before. He began taking calls in the garage with the door shut. Once, I asked who he'd been talking to for 40 minutes, and he said, "Just work," in a tone so casual it almost convinced me not to ask again. Almost. There was a name that started appearing more often in his conversation. Bree. A junior associate at his firm, sharp, ambitious, 29 years old, the same age I'd been when Marcus and I met, a detail I noticed and immediately hated myself for noticing. He mentioned her the way people mention things they've rehearsed mentioning casually. Bree and I closed the Danforth deal today. Bree thinks I should push back the timeline. Small sentences. Harmless on their own. Except there were a lot of them. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that after 11 years of marriage, jealousy over a coworker's name was beneath both of us. I kept telling myself that right up until the night that finally cracked something open. Looking back, I can point to a dozen small moments I brushed past at the time. The way he started working out again suddenly after years of joking that the gym was a scam invented by people with too much free time. A new cologne appeared on the bathroom counter that I never once saw him buy. The Friday nights that used to be ours, takeout and bad reality television on the couch, quietly turned into late closing dinners, 3 weeks in a row, then 4. None of these things on their own meant anything. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't want to see clearly enough to name. My mother used to say that women always know before they know, and I understood that sentence for the first time during those months. I wasn't confused about what was happening. I was simply choosing, day after day, not to look directly at it, because looking directly at it meant I'd have to do something about it, and I wasn't ready yet. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in March, at our own anniversary dinner. I had booked a table at the restaurant where we'd had our first date 9 years earlier, the same corner booth, the same candle in a blue glass holder. I wore the green dress he once said he loved. I sat there for 50 minutes before his assistant called, not him, his assistant, to tell me he was stuck in a closing meeting and would try to make it for dessert. He never made it for dessert. I sat alone at that table, surrounded by other couples celebrating their own milestones, watching a young man across the room propose to his girlfriend, and the whole restaurant erupt into applause, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. Not devastated. Not yet. Just still, the way a room goes still right before you realize the power has gone out. I paid the bill myself. I drove home. And when Marcus finally walked through the door at 11:40 that night, smelling faintly of a bar I didn't recognize, he kissed my forehead, said, "I'm so sorry, babe. I owe you a real celebration," and fell asleep within 12 minutes. I lay awake next to him for a long time that night, and I made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I decided I was done waiting to be noticed. I just didn't know what that decision was going to look like 6 months later, standing under a chandelier, watching my own husband flirt with a woman he didn't realize was me. But before I get to that night, I need to tell you about the invitation that started all of it, because the way it landed in my hands was almost too strange to be a coincidence. 3 weeks after that anniversary dinner, I got a call from an old design school classmate named Priya Anand. She was now the events director for a nonprofit foundation that funded pediatric surgical programs, and she was putting together their annual gala, the kind of black-tie charity auction where donors bid absurd amounts of money for weekend getaways, private chef dinners, and rare bottles of wine, all in the name of a good cause. Priya wasn't calling to invite me as a guest. She was calling because their event designer had backed out 2 weeks before the gala, and she needed someone to redesign the entire ballroom concept from scratch, fast, with almost no budget flexibility and a demanding board of directors breathing down her neck. I said yes before she finished the sentence, partly because I needed the work, and partly because I needed something in my life that had nothing to do with waiting for Marcus to notice me. Here's the detail that made everything that followed possible. Because I was staff for the event rather than a guest, I wasn't on the official attendee list. Nobody at that gala would be expecting to see me there, including my own husband, who I mentioned it to only once, in passing, the way you mention a work trip to someone who's already looking at his phone. He said, "That's great, babe," without looking up. I'm not even sure he registered the word auction. What I didn't tell him, mostly because I didn't fully decide it myself until a week before the event, was that I wasn't planning to spend that night behind the scenes adjusting centerpieces. Priya, half joking, offered me a ticket to actually attend as a guest once the setup was done, since the foundation had a few unclaimed seats at a sponsor table. And somewhere between saying no and saying maybe, I remembered something Marcus had mentioned 2 nights earlier without realizing I was paying attention. His firm was one of the gala's corporate sponsors that year. He was going to be there, with colleagues, possibly with Bree Sinclair, whose name had been coming up a little too often for a little too long, always framed as strictly professional, always mentioned with a small, careful casualness that made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. I'm not going to tell you I had proof of anything. I didn't, not yet. What I had was a feeling, the specific kind of feeling a woman gets when her husband starts choosing his words a little too carefully. And I decided that instead of asking him a question he could easily deflect, I was going to walk into that room myself and watch. There was one more thing that pushed me over the edge, something I hadn't told anyone, not even Priya. 4 days before the gala, I borrowed Marcus's laptop to print a boarding pass while mine updated in the background. His email was still logged in from the day before. I wasn't looking for anything. I told myself that afterward, over and over, like a defense I was building for a jury that only existed in my own head. There was a draft email, never sent, addressed to Bree. 3 sentences long. It talked about a dinner reservation for 2, and it ended with a line I have never been able to fully unread. I know this is complicated, but being around you makes everything else feel quiet for once. I closed the laptop and sat very still for a long time. I never confronted him about it, not directly, not yet. Instead, I did something I think surprised even me. I decided that instead of asking Marcus what everything else meant, I was going to become the version of myself he'd stopped noticing and let him tell me, without knowing who I was, exactly what kind of man he'd become. So, I made a choice that surprised even me. I wasn't going to walk into that ballroom as his wife, tired and hopeful and easy to overlook the way I had become. I was going to walk in as someone he had to notice for the first time all over again. I spent the next 10 days rebuilding the version of myself I'd quietly buried somewhere between the promotion and the anniversary dinner. Not out of vanity, out of curiosity, and if I'm honest, out of anger I hadn't let myself feel yet. I cut 8 inches off my hair and went from the soft brown Marcus had once called safe to a deep auburn that changed the entire shape of my face. I had worn red lipstick since our wedding day because Marcus once said it made me look like I was trying too hard for a Tuesday. I bought it again that same week, almost as an act of defiance against a sentence I'd been carrying for years without realizing it. I found a dress, deep emerald silk, structured in a way that made me stand differently, walk differently, take up space differently than the woman who usually shrank into the corner of her room while her husband worked it. I didn't recognize the woman in the fitting room mirror, and that was exactly the point. I told my sister, Colette, what I was planning mostly because I needed someone to talk me out of it or talk me into it. I genuinely wasn't sure which. She listened for a long time without saying anything, and then she said something I still think about. "You're not doing this to trick him, Adrienne. You're doing this to finally see him clearly. There's a difference." I didn't fully understand what she meant until months later. The morning of the gala, I stood in front of that mirror one more time and asked myself a question I hadn't let myself ask in months. Not, what did I do wrong? A different question. What would happen if the next person to notice me had absolutely no idea who I used to be? I was about to find out. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel I had actually helped renovate 2 years earlier, which felt like its own quiet irony. 12-foot windows, a ceiling of hand-set gold leaf, round tables dressed in ivory linen under low gold light. I had spent the entire afternoon there in flats and a work apron, adjusting floral arrangements and lighting angles with Priya's team, completely unnoticed by the early arriving sponsors, which included, at one point, Marcus's firm's catering coordinator walking right past me, without a second glance. Around 6 o'clock, I watched from a service hallway as the first guests started arriving, tuxedos and gowns spilling out of black cars under the hotel's awning. I felt my pulse pick up in a way I hadn't expected, a strange mix of nerves and something closer to power, the feeling of standing behind a curtain right before it opens. At 7:30, I disappeared into that same service hallway, changed into the emerald dress, redid my makeup in a borrowed compact mirror under fluorescent light that flattered absolutely nothing, and somehow still became someone else entirely. When I walked back out onto the ballroom floor 20 minutes later, one of the security staff who had watched me haul flower boxes all afternoon actually stepped aside and said, "Good evening, ma'am," like he'd never seen me before in his life. That was the first sign it was working. The second sign came 4 minutes later, across the room, near the champagne table, where I saw my husband laughing at something a woman was saying to him. The woman was Bree Sinclair. I recognized her instantly from the firm's website photo. I had definitely not searched for late one night 3 weeks earlier. In person, she was younger looking than her photo, confident in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with knowing exactly how a room was reading her. She was standing close to Marcus, one hand resting lightly on his forearm in that particular way that isn't quite professional and isn't quite personal, existing deliberately in the space between the two. Marcus wasn't pulling away. I want to tell you, I felt rage in that moment. What I actually felt was something quieter and colder, a kind of clarity. I had come here half hoping I was wrong about the feeling I'd had for weeks, half hoping the draft email was some misunderstood joke I'd blown out of proportion. Standing 20 feet away in a dress he'd never seen, watching the ease between them, I understood I hadn't been wrong. I'd just been patient. I didn't approach them. Not yet. I wanted to see what would happen if I let the night unfold on its own terms. I didn't have to wait long. Within the hour, The room began filtering toward the tables for the seated portion of the evening, and I found myself seated, entirely by Priya's careful arrangement, 3 tables away from Marcus's, close enough to watch, far enough to stay unnoticed. The silent auction items were displayed along the perimeter of the room, bid sheets and pens laid out beside each one, everything from spa weekends to a private vineyard tour. The live auction, the one with the big-ticket items, was scheduled for after dinner, and Priya had mentioned to me earlier that week that the final item of the night was something the board had been building buzz around for months. She wouldn't tell me what it was. She just said, with a strange little smile, "You'll want to be in the room for that one." I didn't think much of it at the time. I was far more focused on the man 3 tables away who still hadn't looked at me twice, and on Bree Sinclair, who spent most of dinner leaning slightly too far into every conversation Marcus was part of. Around the salad course, something small happened that I almost missed. Marcus glanced over at my table, briefly, the way you glance at a stranger across a crowded room without meaning anything by it. Our eyes met for half a second. He looked away first. Then, a moment later, he looked back. I felt my whole body go tense, certain he'd recognized me, that this entire plan was about to collapse before it had even really begun. But his expression didn't hold recognition. It held curiosity. The specific, slightly embarrassed curiosity of a man wondering whether he should find a reason to walk over and introduce himself. I watched it all unfold with a strange, detached calm, cataloging every detail the way I used to catalog paint finishes and fabric swatches for a client, methodically, almost professionally, like I was documenting evidence for a case I hadn't yet decided whether I was going to file. That changed around 9:15, during the dessert course, when Marcus excused himself from his table and walked directly toward the bar, which happened to be 6 feet from where I was standing with an untouched glass of champagne, trying to look far more composed than I felt. He ordered a whiskey. Then he turned, and for the first time all night, he actually looked at me. Not a glance. A look, the kind a man gives a woman he's deciding whether or not to talk to. "I feel like I should know you," he said, but I definitely would have remembered. 11 years of marriage, and he delivered that line to me like it was the first sentence he'd ever spoken to a woman in a ballroom. My hands went cold around my glass, but my voice, somehow, came out steady. "Would you?" I said. "People tell me I have one of those faces." He laughed, that easy laugh I used to fall asleep to, and introduced himself. "Marcus Hale," he said, like his name still meant something impressive in a room full of strangers. I told him my name was Adrienne, which was true, and let him assume it was the only truth in the conversation. For the next 20 minutes, my husband flirted with me. He asked what I did. I told him I was an interior designer, technically true, working on a few exciting projects downtown. Also technically true, since the ballroom around us was one of them. He told me about his firm, about a development deal he was closing, about how his wife didn't really get into that side of the business, said with a small, dismissive smile that landed in my chest like a struck match. I asked, carefully, almost gently, "Does your wife know you're here tonight?" He shrugged. "She knows I'm at a work thing. She's not big on these events." I wanted to ask him whether that was because she wasn't invited, or because nobody had ever bothered to tell her the details. I didn't. I smiled instead and said something about how lucky his wife must be to have so much trust in him. He didn't catch the edge in it at all. At one point he mentioned, almost proudly, that he'd almost brought a colleague as his +1 tonight instead of coming stag, then caught himself and laughed it off as a joke about how much he hates going to these things alone. I watched Bree Sinclair, 40 feet away, glance over at us twice in the span of 5 minutes, her expression unreadable, her wine glass staying just a little too full for a little too long. I asked him, still playing the role of a curious stranger, what his wife was like. He paused for a second, longer than felt natural, and said, "She's good. Steady. She used to be more out there when we first got together. Things get busy." He said it the way you describe furniture you've stopped noticing in your own living room, and something in me went very quiet and very sharp at the same time. That's when the MC's voice rang out over the room, announcing that the live auction was about to begin, and Marcus, without asking, Without hesitation, without a single thought toward the woman he'd left alone at their table 40 feet away, said, "Sit with me for this part. I want to see if I can win you something." I said yes. Of course I said yes. I hadn't come this far to walk away before the ending. The live auction moved fast. A week at a lake house in Montana went for $11,000. A private tasting menu experience went for $6,000. Marcus bid on a weekend golf trip, mostly, I realized, to look impressive in front of me, and lost it to a table of surgeons 2 rows back, laughing it off with the kind of confidence men wear when they've never really had to worry about losing anything that mattered. Each time a new item came up, he leaned toward me and whispered a running commentary, half showing off, half genuinely funny in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of the man I'd fallen in love with 9 years earlier. It was disorienting, sitting beside him as a stranger, feeling flickers of the same warmth I used to feel as his wife, knowing none of it was really meant for me at all. It was meant for a version of me he'd invented in the space of 20 minutes, without ever asking my last name. Bree drifted closer at one point, standing near our table with a tight, polite smile, clearly trying to reinsert herself into Marcus's attention. She leaned in and said something about checking on him, that neither of us really believed was the reason she'd walked over. Marcus barely acknowledged her, waving her off with the same distracted ease he usually reserved for waiters he didn't want to make eye contact with. I watched something flicker across her face, somewhere between confusion and irritation, the look of a woman watching her plan for the evening quietly slip out of her hands, and I felt an uncomfortable flicker. My name, my full name, spoken into a microphone in front of 400 people, including the man sitting beside me who had spent the last hour flirting with a stranger who apparently had his wife's exact name and face. I watched it happen in real time. I watched the moment his mind tried to reject what his eyes were telling him, the small furrow between his brows, the way his gaze moved from the podium back to me, and back to the podium again, searching for an explanation that made this not true. The MC continued, explaining that the final item of the night wasn't a physical prize at all. It was the honor of naming the founding donor, whose contribution would be permanently recognized on the Art Center's dedication wall, and that the bidding on that honor would start at $15,000. Marcus turned to me, his voice low, almost pleading. "Adrienne, is that you? Is your name actually Adrienne?" I let the silence sit there for exactly as long as I needed it to. "Yes," I said. "It's actually Adrienne Hale. But you introduced yourself an hour ago like you'd never met me, so I figured I'd return the favor." I watched every drop of color leave his face. I didn't stay to watch him process it, because the bidding had already opened, and I had one more thing I needed to do before this night ended the way I wanted it to. I raised my paddle. Marcus grabbed my arm, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Adrienne, wait. Let's talk about this outside, please." "I'm bidding on my own art center," I said, loud enough that the people at the nearest tables turned to look. "You should let go of my arm before someone assumes you're trying to stop your wife from supporting sick kids." He let go. The bidding climbed fast once people realized what was happening, whispers spreading table to table as the story pieced itself together in real time. A designer bidding to have her own name honored, a husband 3 tables over who had clearly, visibly, spent the evening flirting with his own disguised wife. Bree Sinclair, I noticed, had gone very quiet, very still, at Marcus's abandoned table, her wine glass forgotten in front of her. I bid $20,000. Someone countered with $22,000, a silver-haired man near the front who I later learned was one of the foundation's original founders, delighted by the unfolding scene in a way that felt almost like he was rooting for me. I raised to $25,000. Priya later told me the entire board was standing by that point, half of them fighting back laughter, half of them fighting back tears, all of them absolutely riveted. At $30,000, the room fell silent, waiting to see if anyone would challenge me again. Nobody did. The gavel came down. Sold to Adrienne Hale for $30,000. The applause that followed wasn't polite charity applause. It was the kind of applause that comes from 400 strangers who just watched something they'll be talking about at dinner parties for the next year. Someone near the back actually stood up first, and the standing spread through the room like a current, table by table, until I was standing in the middle of a ballroom full of people applauding a decision I hadn't fully understood the weight of until that exact second. I stood up, smoothed my dress, and looked at my husband for the first time all night as exactly who I actually was. "You spent an hour trying to find out if I was interesting enough to talk to?" I said. 11 years, and you never once looked at me like that at home." He didn't have an answer. For the first time in longer than I could remember, Marcus Hale had absolutely nothing to say. I walked out of that ballroom alone, past Bree Sinclair's frozen expression, past a security guard who this time said nothing at all, and into the cool night air outside, where I stood on the curb in my emerald dress and finally let myself breathe. I want to tell you the rest of this ends with some dramatic divorce filing filmed for the cameras, because that would make a tidier story. The truth is quieter and, I think, more honest. Marcus called me 11 times that night. I didn't answer any of them. I sat in my car outside the hotel for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to drive, replaying the look on his face over and over, somewhere between shame and something that almost looked like grief, as though he was mourning a version of the night that had never actually existed. The next morning, he showed up at our house with flowers he clearly bought from a gas station on the way over, still slightly wrinkled from being left on the passenger seat, and an apology that started with "it wasn't what it looked like," which is, in my experience, the exact sentence people say when it was precisely what it looked like. I didn't scream at him. I didn't need to. I told him what I'd realized standing in that ballroom. Watching a room full of strangers see me more clearly in 1 hour than my own husband had in the last 2 years. I told him about the draft email, the one he never sent, the one I'd read by accident and never brought up until that exact moment. I watched his face collapse in a way I almost felt sorry for. He tried to explain the email. He said nothing had actually happened with Bree, that it had been an emotional thing, not a physical thing, as though that distinction was supposed to make it hurt less instead of more. I told him that I didn't need him to confess to anything physical to understand that he had already left our marriage in every way that actually mattered. He had left it in the small, quiet decisions months before that gala, long before I ever put on that emerald dress. I told him that the version of me he'd been flirting with wasn't a stranger. She was simply the version of me he'd stopped bothering to notice a long time ago, and that should have terrified him a lot more than it apparently did. For days after the gala, while Marcus and I were still living under the same roof in a strange, tense silence neither of us had figured out how to break, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. It was Bree. She didn't yell. She didn't apologize either, not really, not at first. Her voice was tight and careful, the voice of someone who had clearly rehearsed the call in her head several times before actually making it. She said she thought I deserved to hear directly from her that nothing physical had happened between her and Marcus, as though that single fact was supposed to resolve everything else sitting unresolved between the three of us. I told her I appreciated the honesty and I meant it, but that I hadn't called this meeting she had, and I wanted to know why she felt the need to make it at all. There was a long pause before she answered. "Because I watched you stand up in that ballroom," she said, "and I realized I've spent 2 years auditioning for a role that was never actually open." He kept telling me things were complicated at home. I believed him. I don't think I want to believe him anymore. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. I felt tired mostly, and a little sad for both of us, two women who had trusted the same unreliable narrator in different ways. I told her that whatever she decided to do next was hers to decide, but that she might want to ask herself why a man who described his marriage as complicated never once used the word over. Because there's a very specific reason men keep marriages in that particular gray area, and it's rarely about protecting anyone but themselves. She was quiet for a moment, and then she thanked me, oddly, and hung up. I never heard from her directly again, though Priya mentioned months later that Bree had, in fact, transferred to a different regional office not long after. A detail I neither celebrated nor mourned. Some people only learn a lesson once they've had to watch someone else pay the tuition for it. We separated 3 weeks later. Not out of anger, not entirely, but out of the simple, exhausting truth that some marriages don't end in a single dramatic betrayal. They end slowly, in 1,000 small moments of not being seen, until one night forces you to finally look directly at what's been true for a very long time. The story didn't stay contained to the two of us for long, either. Priya told me later that the gala had raised more money in its final 20 minutes than in the previous 3 hours combined, and that donors had started calling the foundation the following week just to ask if the auction woman's story was true. The board asked me, half-jokingly at first, if I would consider serving as a permanent advisor for future events. I said yes, mostly because I liked the idea of building something out of the exact night my old life quietly ended. Marcus's firm, it turned out, took a quieter but very real hit. Word travels fast in small professional circles, and his senior partner publicly flirting with his own disguised wife, while his actual date for the evening stood 40 feet away, is not the kind of story that stays contained to one ballroom. I heard, secondhand, that Bree transferred to a different office a few months later. Whether that was her choice or someone else's, I honestly don't know, and I've made peace with not knowing. As for Marcus, I heard he and Bree reconnected briefly after everything settled, which honestly didn't surprise me and didn't sting the way I once thought it might. I hope, genuinely, that if that relationship continues, he learns to actually see her in a way he never learned to see me before it's too late for that one too. The art center is under construction now. My name is going to be on that dedication wall permanently, which still feels strange to think about every time I drive past the site on my way to a client meeting. I lead the design firm that grew out of that single gala, and Priya, who set the whole accidental chain of events in motion, is now my business partner. We've since taken on 3 more nonprofit projects together, each one a little bigger than the last. I moved into a smaller house about 6 months after the separation, one I designed entirely for myself for the first time in my adult life. No compromises, no paint swatches I secretly hated because someone else preferred them. I painted the front door the exact shade of emerald green the first wore that night, which my sister Colette says is either poetic or slightly unhinged, depending on the day she asks me about it. The design firm Priya, and I built out of that single chaotic night, has grown faster than either of us expected. We now have a small team of 5, a waitlist of clients that stretches almost a year out, and a standing joke in the office that any project pitch is automatically approved if someone can work the phrase fine. I still think about that moment, standing at the bar in a dress I'd never worn before, listening to my own husband describe me to my own face as steady and not really into that side of the business. I used to think that sentence was the saddest part of the whole story. Now I think it was the most useful thing anyone ever said to me because it told me, with total honesty, exactly how small I had let myself become in my own marriage and exactly how much bigger I still had room to be. My sister Colette still brings up that night at almost every family dinner, usually to embarrass me in front of whoever's visiting, retelling the story with more theatrical flair each time until I've started to lose track of which details are true and which ones she's added for effect. My mother, on the other hand, rarely mentions it directly. She just squeezes my hand a little tighter whenever the topic of Marcus comes up, the same way she used to when I was a teenager coming home from a bad day at school, and I understand now that some kinds of support don't need any words attached to them at all. I ran into Marcus once, about 8 months after everything settled, at a hardware store of all places, both of us reaching for the same shade of exterior paint at the same display wall. We talked for a few minutes, polite and careful, the way people do when too much history sits behind too little conversation. He told me he was doing better, seeing a therapist for the first time in his life, trying to understand, in his words, how I let myself become someone who needed a stranger to remind him his wife was interesting. I told him I hoped that was true, and I meant it. I didn't need him to suffer to feel like I'd won anything. I'd already won the only thing that mattered, which was myself. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled that night, whether there was a gentler, quieter way to find out the truth. I've thought about that question a lot, and my honest answer is no. A quiet conversation over dinner would have given Marcus room to explain, to soften, to talk his way around the edges of what was actually happening, the way he'd been doing for months already, without me fully noticing. Standing in that ballroom stripped all of that away. There was no script for him to follow.